It is September 18th, 2017, and Toys R Us, a company that once operated more than 1,600 stores across 35 countries and taught two generations of American children what a birthday list looked like, walks into a courthouse in Richmond, Virginia, and files for Chapter 11, bankruptcy protection, carrying $5 billion in debt. That debt had nothing to do with selling toys and everything to do with a leveraged buyout 12 years earlier, when two private equity firms and a real estate investment trust bought the company and left their own purchase price sitting on its books like a mortgage handed to a tenant who never agreed to buy the house. 8 months later, the last Toys R Us in America would close its doors, and grown adults who had never expected to cry in a strip mall parking lot would stand outside taking photographs of an empty building where Jeffrey the giraffe used to wave from the window. This is the story of a company that did not lose to Amazon, did not lose to Walmart, and did not lose to changing childhoods. It lost to a balance sheet built by people who never intended to sell a single toy. This is where we take apart the companies that built the American consumer world down to the ledger and the executive who signed it. If this is your kind of story, subscribe and hit like, because Toys R Us did not die of natural causes, and the autopsy runs through Wall Street, not Fifth Avenue. Charles Lazarus was born in Washington, D.C. in 1923, the son of a bicycle repairman. He grew up watching his father fix used bikes and resell them, and by the time Lazarus returned home from Army service in World War II, he had already absorbed a lesson that would define the rest of his life. People will always want things for their children, and they will pay for quality if you give them enough of it to choose from. In 1948, Lazarus opened a furniture shop in Washington called Children's Bargain Town, selling baby furniture out of a storefront his father had once used for bicycles. Customers kept asking him for toys, so Lazarus started stocking a shelf of them, then a wall, then most of the store. By 1957, he had renamed the business Toys R Us, with the R deliberately printed backward, a small imperfection that made the sign look like a child had written it. The idea behind the name was the idea behind the entire company. This was not a toy department inside someone else's store. This was a toy supermarket, built the way Lazarus had watched grocery stores operate: high volume, deep selection, low margin, and shelves stocked to the ceiling. That supermarket model was not obvious in 1957. Department stores sold toys seasonally, stacking bicycles and dolls near the holidays and clearing the space by January. Lazarus bet the opposite way. He believed toys were not a seasonal category, but a year-round one, and he built stores the size of airplane hangars to prove it. Each Toys R Us carried roughly 18,000 different items, a scale no department store toy aisle could approach. In 1966, Lazarus sold the company to Interstate Stores, a variety store chain, for approximately $7.5 million, staying on to run the toy division while Interstate expanded into other retail categories. It was a decision that would very nearly destroy everything he had built. Interstate overextended itself across department stores and discount chains through the early 1970s, and in 1974, the parent company filed for bankruptcy. Most subsidiaries in that position get liquidated piece by piece. Toys R Us did not, because even in bankruptcy court, the numbers on Lazarus's toy stores told a different story than the numbers everywhere else in the company. The toy division was profitable. It was the only part of Interstate that worked. In 1978, Interstate Stores reorganized around its one functioning business and renamed itself Toys R Us Incorporated, with Charles Lazarus as chief executive of the entire company he had once merely supplied to. What followed was 2 decades of expansion with almost no equal in American retail history. Lazarus took the company public in 1978. By the mid-1980s, Toys R Us was opening new stores at a pace of roughly one every 2.5 days. The stores were deliberately Spartan, warehouse-style buildings with concrete floors and metal shelving stacked to the rafters, because Lazarus wanted every dollar visible in inventory and price, not in architecture. Geoffrey the Giraffe, introduced as the company mascot in 1965 and refined through the 1970s and the 1980s, became one of the most recognized commercial characters in the country, second in some surveys only to Ronald McDonald. The jingle, "I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid," debuted in a 1985 commercial and would run in some form for more than a decade, embedding itself so deeply in American childhood that people born decades apart can still sing it unprompted. By 1990, Toys R Us controlled roughly 20% of the entire American toy market, more than its next several competitors combined. Revenue crossed $5.5 billion. The company operated in more than a dozen countries, and Lazarus himself had become one of the highest-paid executives in the United States, a fact Forbes noted with some astonishment, given that his product was, literally, playthings. The strategy that built this dominance was called category killing, and Toys R Us essentially invented the term. Rather than compete with department stores on a shared floor, Lazarus built freestanding stores so large and so deep in selection that smaller toy retailers could not survive nearby. FAO Schwarz retreated into a handful of flagship locations. Regional toy chains closed one by one. Even Sears and Kmart quietly scaled back their toy departments because they could not match the prices or the selection under one roof with rent to pay on 10 other categories. Toys R Us had become to toys what the supermarket had become to groceries, and for a generation of American parents, a birthday or a Christmas list essentially meant a drive to one of the company's yellow and red warehouses. In 1983, the company extended the formula into a new category entirely, opening the first Kids R Us clothing stores. In 1996, it launched Babies R Us, catching a second wave of the same demographic before the children had even been born. By the mid-1990s, honest observers inside and outside the company believed Toys R Us was close to unbeatable. The threat that ended that belief did not come from another toy store. It came from two directions the company badly underestimated, and Lazarus retired as chief executive in 1994, watching from the board as the company he built encountered problems he had never had to solve. The first threat was Walmart, which by the late 1990s had grown large enough to sell toys as what retailers call a loss leader, pricing them near cost specifically to draw shoppers into the store for everything else. Toys R Us could not compete on price against a company that did not need its toy aisle to turn a profit. In 1998, Walmart overtook Toys R Us as the largest toy retailer in the United States. The second threat arrived through a phone line and a browser window. Amazon, founded in 1994 as an online bookstore, had expanded into toys by the late 1990s, and it offered something no physical warehouse ever could: infinite shelf space and delivery to the door. Toys R Us, a company built entirely around the physical warehouse as its competitive weapon, watched two competitors attack its two founding advantages simultaneously: price from Walmart and convenience from Amazon, and it did not have an answer to either. In August 2000, Toys R Us made a decision that would become one of the most cited cautionary tales in e-commerce history. Rather than build its own online retail operation from scratch, the company signed a 10-year exclusive partnership with Amazon, agreeing to pay Amazon roughly $50 million a year, plus a share of sales in exchange for being the exclusive seller of toys and baby products on Amazon's platform. with Amazon handling the website, the checkout, and the customer relationship. You can read that decision two ways, and honest history holds both at once. One reading says it was the only rational move available to a warehouse retailer with no internet infrastructure and a shrinking window to establish an online presence at all. The other reading says Toys R Us handed its most dangerous competitor the customer data, the browsing habits, and the direct relationship with millions of toy-buying families, effectively training Amazon's own toy business at Toys R Us's expense, while believing it had outsourced a problem instead of feeding one. By 2004, Amazon had begun allowing third-party sellers to list toys and baby products directly on its site, in direct violation, Toys R Us argued, of the exclusivity agreement. Toys R Us sued. In 2006, a New Jersey court ruled that Amazon had indeed breached the contract and awarded Toys R Us $51 million in damages, a sum that settled the legal question and changed nothing about the strategic one. Toys R Us walked away from the partnership having spent nearly a decade not building the online retail muscle every other major retailer was quietly developing during the same years. When the arrangement ended, the company had the lawsuit victory and the empty shelf space where an e-commerce division should have been. But the online failure alone would not have killed Toys R Us. What killed Toys R Us was a transaction that had nothing to do with toys at all. In 2005, a consortium made up of the private equity firms Kohlberg, Kravis Roberts, and Bain Capital, alongside the real estate investment trust, Vornado Realty Trust, purchased Toys R Us in a leveraged buyout valued at $6.6 billion. A leveraged buyout works by using the target company's own future earnings, and often its own assets, as collateral for the debt used to purchase it. The buyers put in a comparatively small amount of their own capital and borrowed the rest, and then the acquired company, not the buyers, becomes responsible for paying that borrowed money back. Toys R Us, a retailer already fighting Walmart on price, and Amazon on convenience, emerged from the 2005 buyout carrying approximately $5.3 billion in new debt, an obligation requiring roughly $400 million to $450 million a year, simply in interest payments, money that came directly out of funds that would otherwise have gone toward renovating stores, building a real commerce platform, or competing on price. The company was not just fighting two of the most dangerous retailers of the internet age. It was fighting them with one hand tied to a debt payment schedule written by people who had already made their money on the deal, regardless of how the fight went. KKR and Bain collected transaction and advisory fees from the buyout itself, fees paid by Toys R Us, whether the company thrived afterward or not. For a decade, Toys R Us management did what companies drowning in leveraged buyout debt almost always do. It managed decline rather than growth. Store renovations slowed. New store openings nearly stopped. Employee headcount and training budgets shrank while the interest payments continued on schedule, year after year, regardless of how the holiday season had gone. The company's own operating business was not catastrophic through most of this period. Toys R Us was, in many years, generating positive operating income. The problem was never really the toy business. The problem was that almost none of that operating income was left over after debt service to reinvest in the business that generated it. It is a distinction that matters enormously and gets lost in the popular telling. Toys R Us did not fail because people stopped buying toys there. Toys R Us failed because a healthy retail operation was made to carry a debt load sized for a much larger, much more profitable company. And every year that passed without paying that debt down meaningfully was a year the company fell further behind competitors who were reinvesting instead of servicing interest. By 2017, the picture had become unsustainable. Toys R Us was still generating more than $11 billion in annual revenue, a figure that startled many observers, because a company doing that much business does not read, on the surface, like a company about to collapse. But $5 billion of long-term debt was coming due, and the company's private equity owners could not refinance it on workable terms. On September 18, 2017, Toys R Us filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, initially insisting the goal was reorganization, not liquidation. Management told employees and suppliers the stores would stay open through the crucial holiday season, while the company restructured its debt. For a few months, that appeared possible. Then, in March 2018, after failing to secure the financing needed to continue operating through reorganization, Toys R Us announced it would liquidate its entire United States operation. Roughly 735 stores were scheduled to close. Approximately 33,000 employees lost their jobs. Many of them informed they would receive no severance at all, a detail that became its own scandal, since the company's private equity owners had collected hundreds of millions in fees over the preceding 13 years, while the workers who staffed the stores were told there was nothing left for them. Public pressure eventually forced KKR and Bain, though not Vornado, to establish a $20 million hardship fund for former employees, a sum that amounted to a few $100s per worker, a gesture campaigners at the time described as barely covering the cost of what had been taken. The closures unfolded through the spring of 2018 in a way that generated a genuine wave of public grief, an emotional response unusual for a corporate bankruptcy. News crews filmed adults, now in their 30s and 40s, walking the aisles of their neighborhood Toys R Us one last time, some crying openly on camera, standing in front of shelves that had once represented for an entire generation the physical geography of childhood wanting. The jingle played over local news segments. Jeffrey the Giraffe appeared in farewell social media posts that read like eulogies. By June 2018, the flagship Times Square store, a 3-story location with its own indoor Ferris wheel that had opened in 2001 as a monument to the company's confidence in physical retail, was closed and eventually gutted. The company that had once opened a store every 2.5 days now had none left standing under its own name in the country where it was founded. Charles Lazarus, the man who had carved a toy supermarket out of his father's bicycle shop, died on March 22, 2019, at the age of 94, 11 months after the last American stores under his name had closed. Reports at the time noted the timing without needing to editorialize on it. He had built a company that dominated a category so completely that its name became a generic term for a certain kind of childhood memory, and he lived just long enough to watch it disappear, not because children stopped wanting toys, but because a financial transaction 18 years after he stepped down from the company had loaded it with a weight it could never set down. The name did not stay buried for long. In 2019, the hedge funds that had inherited what remained of Toys R Us through the bankruptcy process reopened 2 flagship stores under a new operating entity called True Kids, one in New Jersey and one in Texas, both smaller than the old warehouse format and built around interactive play areas rather than deep shelf inventory. Neither achieved anything close to the old scale. In 2021, the brand took a different path entirely. Global, a brand management firm, acquired the intellectual property and struck a partnership with Macy's, placing branded Toys R Us shop-in-shop sections inside Macy's department stores across the country, the exact retail format Charles Lazarus had spent his career proving obsolete, now hosting his own company's name as a tenant rather than an owner. A small number of standalone Toys R Us stores have since opened in shopping malls and airports, modest in size, closer in spirit to children's bargain town than to the concrete warehouses that once defined the brand. What survives is not the empire. It is the memory of the empire, preserved with unusual intensity for a retail chain. The jingle remains one of the most recognized pieces of American advertising ever produced, still capable of triggering an immediate, involuntary hum from people who have not set foot in a Toys R Us in a decade. Geoffrey the Giraffe merchandise circulates in vintage and nostalgia markets. The Times Square Ferris wheel, dismantled when the store closed, has become a piece of retail trivia repeated in articles about the death of physical shopping. Former employees maintain online communities trading photographs of store layouts and name badges the way veterans of other collapsed companies in this archive have done, treating the closed stores less like a former employer and more like a shared inheritance. The 2005 leveraged buyout is now taught in business school case studies as one of the clearest illustrations of how financial engineering can extract value from an operating company while leaving it structurally unable to survive its own competitive environment. A cautionary tale cited in the same breath as several other private equity-driven retail collapses that followed similar patterns in the years after. Toys R Us did not lose to Amazon, though the failed partnership certainly did not help. Toys R Us did not lose to Walmart, though the price war certainly hurt. Toys R Us lost to a $6.6 billion transaction in 2005 that had nothing to do with selling a single toy, structured by people who were paid regardless of what happened to the stores, the employees, or the children standing in front of shelves that no longer exist. Charles Lazarus built a supermarket for childhood out of his father's bicycle shop and spent 4 decades proving that people would drive across town for selection and price. The company he built did not fail to sell toys. It failed to survive the debt other people attached to its name. If you ever walked those concrete aisles, sang the jingle in the back seat of your parents' car, or stood in a Toys R Us parking lot in the spring of 2018 taking one last photograph, drop a comment below. Tell us the store, the city, and the toy you remember walking out with. The people who grew up in those aisles know more about what was built and what was lost than the firms that financed its ending. Subscribe, because this archive is still being built, and we have the story of another American retail empire coming next.